Hello everyone, my name is Chris Holmes and this is my SDC project on multi-grade classroom instruction. So for my introduction, I think it's important to note that teachers that work in youth detention centers across the state face many challenges besides student behaviors and motivation. These teachers have a big responsibility in the sense that they have up to 12 to 15 kids in the classroom that range from 6th to 12th grade that could be taking any number of classes in that one setting in about 6 periods a day. So that's multiple preps for these teachers. So my motivation for this research is that I currently do contract work in or in multiple YDCs across the state, providing instructional support to teachers as well as coaching and modeling in and outside of the facility. It became aware to me that many teachers struggle to meet the daily curricular needs of these students just because of the multiple number of preps and the multiple number of students, and the particular environment that they work in is not always conducive for learning. So there needs to be something to help address this deficit, this gap, this issue, because teachers, just like teachers in the public school district, are being evaluated and assessed on how well the students are performing. The purpose of this research is to try to increase teacher quality and effectiveness through using multi-grade classroom instructional practices that typically foster student motivation, increase engagement, but also simply help teachers teach students on their particular grade level or in that particular course that they're taking with that teacher. So if we look at the research for multi-grade classroom instructional practices, there are 6 tenets that are basically evident. The first one would be classroom organization. The next would be classroom management. Then it's self-directed student learning, instructional delivery, instruction and curriculum, and then peer tutoring. So if you look at these 6 tenets, 4 of those deal directly with the teachers and 2 of those deal with students. Students have to have a responsibility in this particular process. So data was collected from February of this year until April. Now be mindful that in February, 2 weeks of that included training and modeling, so there was really no true observations that dealt with including the tenets of the practices. It was just looking at teacher practices on a regular basis and then providing support and training of the multi-grade classroom instructional practices. I'm only looking at one particular class and one teacher. Her class ranges from 12 to 15 students depending on the day. Sometimes students aren't reporting to class because of behavior issues, and they may have to remain in their block instead of coming to class that day. Data was collected prior to implementation of training, which is my control. So we're looking at how did this teacher typically perform on a daily basis with these students in implementing grade level, course level work. The sources of data would be teacher interview. This was done bi-monthly. Teacher survey, pre and post, monitoring of teacher practices as it relates to the 6 tenets of multi-grade level classroom practices, as well as monitoring student behavior. Now, the ultimate goal of the research is not to address student behavior, but it should be inferred that if the teacher is increasing the quality of her practices, that you should have a decrease in student engagement or a decrease in student misconduct and an increase in student engagement. So that was the hope. So that's why I also want to look at how students were behaving as we implemented these practices. So let's look at the forms of data collection. So the first form of data collection was a 10-question survey for the teacher, and she was just to read this and then rate herself from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we will look at her survey results pre and post later on in the presentation. there was also a multi-grade classroom instructional teacher interview, and I conducted this with the teacher just to get a feel for how she felt things were going as we implemented these practices. These answers were semi-constructed. There were some probes that were thrown in along the way, just to get a better understanding of how she understood multi-classroom instruction and how she felt the implementation could be effective with her students. The third form of data collection was a teacher monitoring form that I used when I went in the classroom to observe her. So this form includes the 6 tenets of multi-grade classroom instructional practices, and then I kind of dive deeper into by providing specifics of what that could look like in the classroom. So as you go through, I'm basically tallying when these particular aspects of the tenets are being observed, and I'll show you how that data looked as well as we move through the presentation. The last form of data collection was the student monitoring form, and this form basically resembles the classroom setup. So there's basically 5 groupings of students in the class, and I tallied each time I observed misconduct from a student in the classroom, and this was totaled. And so you'll also see how this data looked later in the presentation. So let's look first at the teacher survey. So the initial survey findings, she had a total of 1 strongly agreed responses, 3 agree, 3 no opinions, 2 disagree responses, and only 1 strongly disagree response. After the 4-week observation period and implementation of the multi-grade classroom instructional practices, the teacher responded with 2 strongly agree, 5 agree responses, 2 no opinions, only 1 disagree, and only 1 strongly disagree. So if you're looking at the data, this was leaning more towards the positive side in terms of she was becoming more confident with the implementation of multi-grade classroom instructional practices, still dealing with a couple of issues because she still had 1 strongly disagree and 1 disagree. But it was good to see that she had increased her agree from 3 to 5 and increased her strongly agree from 1 to 2. If we look at the implementation of the multi-grade classroom practices, in week 1, this is after the 2-week training, only 7 of the 34 total aspects of the tenets were observed. The second observation in that first week, it actually dropped from 7 to 5. In week 2, it increased the first time to 11 practices were observed, and then 14 within that second week. In week 3, she increased to 22 of the 34 practices being observed. There was no collection done the second time in the 3rd week because there was a lockdown in the facility and there were no students in the classroom. So we move on to week 4. The first observation in week 4, she had increased to 26 of the 34 instructional practices being observed, and then the final observation, I observed 28 of 34 practices being implemented. So if we go over and look at off-task student behavior, in week 1, there were a total of 66 off-task behaviors in that first observation. That decreased in the second observation for the first week to 54. In week 2, there were 40 each observation in that week. In week 3, it decreased to 36. Only for the first observation. Once again, there was no data collected in that second observation in the 3rd week due to lockdown. And then in the 4th week, the first observation was 22 misconducts being observed, and then 26 the second observation within the 4th week. So you can see there seems to be a strong correlation between the number of practices being implemented and the decrease in student misconduct. Now granted, in this facility you're going to have some issues with behavior just because of the nature of the facility and the nature of the students who are being serviced. So there's another issue that's going on in the facility I'll discuss later towards the end as I share out my final thoughts. I do want to let you know, in the interview process, the teacher spoke very positively about being able to effectively implement these instructional practices. Since she had been teaching a facility for such a long period of time, it was a challenge to get her to adapt some of the practices, as she didn't feel comfortable or feel that the students would really adjust to what she was trying to do with them. But with more practice, I believe that she could increase, maybe not to all 34 practices, but at least to 28 to 30 on an average on a weekly basis with those students. Once she gets into a routine of implementation, I think she will see students will begin to respond to her instructional delivery and practices and continue to increase engagement, decrease their misconduct, and hopefully it would just kind of roll over into students who aren't as engaged to kind of adjust their behavior, self-check, and then get on board with the things she's trying to do. Now, as it relates to the facility, you have to understand that these teachers teach in a youth detention center that offers educational services. So there are many limitations to what she can do, because there are guards that help support the facility itself, not just education. So there are many things that are out of control of the teacher, along with behavior, along with discipline. So many of the observations that were done that dealt with misconduct, some of those numbers decreased because they were held or they were being controlled by the facility themselves and not so much the teacher. But she did have some input into the outcome of the students in terms of discipline. So I did want to address that as a possible limitation, maybe as a barrier to the research. But as you can see, if this can work with this particular teacher, I really believe the use of these practices to really help increase engagement, peer tutoring, peer services, self-directed learning can help these students really propel academically, and hopefully once they are released back into civilization, that can create a greater motivation and value for learning, and that will carry over into their regular public school setting. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.